Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today, I've got Mike Abugow with us, and we're going to be talking about extreme programming. And as for myself, someone who did not come from a programming background, I've only dabbled in a little bit of Android and this, that, and the other, and mostly design programming kind of stuff. I've wanted to understand more about extreme programming, and so Mike's going to be here with us to explain a little bit more about it and just the power of it in Scrum and where it falls into Scrum. So, Mike, how you doing?
Well, and yourself, James.
Doing great, Mike. So today I've got you here, and thank you so much for coming on.
My
And
pleasure.
yeah, well, tell us more about extreme programming. Like, what is extreme programming?
Well, if we want to think about extreme programming, it's really a way to, going back, over 20 years to around 1996, thinking about how we actually break up work into smaller chunks, how we make it more thoughtful, how we actually craft how we're going to create things through the case of user stories. That's where we get user stories from, in small pieces of work. And are we going to do this thoughtfully, which, thinks about different types of driven development, like test-driven development, feature-driven development. How do we want to work together in pairs and in teams in a clearly defined team space, whether that's a room or a group of tables inside of a larger room for an individual team? All these different things that we take for granted today come from the work that was discovered in '96 and done through Chrysler for extreme programming.
Gotcha. So tell us about the terms of, let's just go through real quick for anyone who may be a new Scrum Master or new to Scrum or Agile. Like, tell us a little bit about the terms. You mentioned TDD and feature-driven development. Tell us more about those and maybe some others that we may have glazed over.
Sure. So different types of driven developments. We have test-driven development, which when you think about it, you test, or it's also called test first. You come up with your test cases, your automated tests for the work that you're going to be creating in the future, and you write just enough code to make those tests pass. So you have test-driven development.
Okay.
When you think about feature-driven development, you're thinking about what is the feature, and you're writing just enough code again to drive those features. Just enough. When we think about behavior-driven development, a lot of that is currently used by our automation engineers, our QA automation specialists. They're writing test cases to account for the different types of users and the behaviors that these users are going to actually be acting upon on the system. So I'm going to log in. That's one behavior. I'm going to go from logging into a web app into another portion of the system. I have to click on a menu. I then have to go onto a sub-menu, which takes me into a landing page. All these sets of behaviors that are going to be tested. So when we think about it, and there's always close collaboration between these different styles that all work together very well between a development specialist and a quality specialist and a product owner to make sure that we're doing just enough to get the job done.
Gotcha. So I was reading a little bit about behavior-driven development, and that's where, for me, code can get very, I don't know what the word is, spaghetti. Like it's just a bunch of terms I don't understand, but it seemed like behavior-driven development, there was an effort to write the code, and correct me if I'm wrong, but to write the code in such a way that you could sit down with someone who's not who's like me, who doesn't understand code as much, and I'd be able to read the code easier. Is that correct?
It really is, because when you think about behavior-driven development, it's all the writing style from a programmatic standpoint is called is very much like English. So you have a given statement, a when statement, and a then statement. So given a particular user of the system, when they perform an action, then they get a result.
Mm-hmm.
And that, when you're thinking about behavior-driven, that's all that you're really looking at. Now, there's different tools you can use for behavior-driven development testing, but you can write those out, and most of the tools will recognize those particular fragments and be able to test on them.
So that's where, because in TDD, I noticed that there was a difference. You're doing the tests, but behavior-driven development is when like someone like me would be able to step in and I'd be able to understand, hey, we got from this user story, and now this is in the code, and I can see kind of a more one-to-one, code to user story kind of comparison there. I'd be able to read the code based on the story, kind of, is what I'm understanding.
Depending upon how it's written out, definitely.
Okay.
Because there's some tools that there's some behavior-driven test tools that are written and created in such a fashion that they do a lot of recording. So it takes the actual programmatics out of it. And when they're recording, it's recording clicks on the screen. Now, I wouldn't necessarily lean towards doing something like that.
Okay.
But for somebody just starting out who wants to try behavior-driven development, they can use a tool like Selenium WebDriver and the Selenium IDE and go, I'm going to click on these different things on the screen. It's going to record it as I'm clicking. And then I can go back and look at what it actually recorded programmatically to see what the elements were on the screen, what the usernames that were used to pass information back and forth, and whether or not things came out as expected with a 200 response. Now, the problem with doing something like that, when you're working on a web app and you're clicking on things on a screen, they all have what's called an index value.
Okay.
And that's just something for the application to keep in mind of where something lays out on the screen. And it's a lot of times it's an element on the screen that has a particular value that we can then add new things onto. So if we wanted to add a new cell to a page, it's going to get a new index value. Now, depending upon where we place that on a menu, if we place it, if there's already 5 items in a menu and we add in a new third item, that just changes all of our indexes below it. So you have to be very careful in a point-click record type of fashion that you don't change your indexes.
Okay.
So where there's other ways to save it, and which is why we really like to use behavior-driven development, and we like to write the test cases. And we like to write the scripts, so it's look for this element, look for that element, expect this result, as opposed to look for this index.
Gotcha.
Look for something called.
Okay. So besides the DDDs, as you called them, are there any other terms that are in extreme programming that our viewers might want to go research or figure out that you're aware of?
So there are a lot that, when you think about it, you have continuous integration and continuous deployment pipelines. So continuous integration is when any type of code is checked in to a code repository, whether that's a development specialist code coming in, whether that's a quality specialist coming in. If it's somebody in UX who's checking something in, or somebody from content, if you're using a content management system, checking code into a code base, these things have to get deployed. And a continuous integration environment allows the collection of all these things and then to be tested. So it pulls back into the test-driven and all these different types of automated tests that can happen. And then it gets deployed out to another environment. And there's different tools for that. So I'm not going to, get into a tool conversation because that's really, people have very heartfelt reasons for the tools they choose. Now, when we think about it even further, you have things like non-functional requirements that also kind of come out of extreme programming. Things like security. How do we handle that? How do we handle things like uptime and change failure? All these different things that aren't necessarily accounted for but have to be there anyway.
Okay.
That have come about from a much more thoughtful process that extreme programming espouses that we sometimes forget about.
Gotcha. So these are the tools that a allow teams to actually work as a team, correct? Like Scrum, I mean, you can just go through the framework and um, I've had a team or a couple teams that, it seems like they're just taking task work sometimes and they're not really doing some of these things. How did you get a team, or can you tell me about a time where you had a team and you helped them get from, just doing task work to using some of these tools to be able to actually become more of a team, or just expand on how extreme programming allows them to act as a team? I don't want to get you into too personal examples, but
I wouldn't say it necessarily allows them to work more as a team. It's more of a thoughtful interaction of team members and how work is broken down and how work is implemented. And it really, when you think about these different practices and principles through extreme programming, it fosters communication, even deeper communication and deeper trust than just teams, working in any framework that they're just working in. It requires constant communication. One of the best examples of this is paired programming.
Mm-hmm.
You have two people sitting in front of a terminal, classic paired programming. They might have two separate keyboards, two separate mice, separate monitors, using the exact same computer, taking turns back and forth on implementing a piece of functionality. But you have one person in that example who's constantly, it's their turn to write, and while the other person is actually doing a code review, on a live code review. So, and they bounce ideas off of each other. Now that might be two different developers working together, two different QA specialists working together, a developer and a QA working together. It could be any combination of those individuals, and even a product owner, as a pair.
Okay.
So you can do a lot of these practices in other groups. I've seen them work with product owners, in product owner teams. UX is a great example where they use extreme programming practices and principles when they're creating a new system and thinking about how is this behavior going to work? How do we want our new application or a new version of our application to work before teams get involved? So you have all these different things that allow and promote communication. And the way that these work is, extreme programming says, when you look at everything that works about it, the team has a dedicated team space. There's not one person sitting at one desk and then maybe somebody else on another floor or another building sitting at another desk, and they're passing things back and forth. Yes, technology, especially today in COVID era, we have a lot of tools that we can use that foster paired development. But it's not, when we go back into an office, it's not teams that are spread out. It's team members if they're doing an XP type of work style and using those practices and principles side by side.
Gotcha. And they're working together, not just on each of their own tasks separately. Like they're working these practices. Sounds like you're saying they improve communication, but really it's getting them to work side by side together, and that's why the communication is increased, correct?
Yes, it increases that communication, increases trust, it increases openness. Interesting how some of these terms sound familiar,
right?
Especially, if you're a Scrum Master, you're thinking about, well, I want trust, I want openness, I want honesty, and I know I've read these things in the Scrum Guide. Well, yeah, yes, you certainly have. And these are things that having paired development fosters.
Makes total sense. And that also explains why, like from past experience, when I see people working separately and, there might be, great harmony within the group or whatever, but that communication or that the way they're taking on the work isn't doesn't seem like it's being swarmed kind of a deal. They're not attacking it together. They're each taking their part and attacking it separately.
Exactly.
Okay.
A great modern thought process and influencer on what we think about extreme programming is Rich Sheridan and his company Menlo Innovations out of Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Okay.
Their entire premise has been built around extreme programming and principles. If you want to read about it, he wrote about it in Joy Inc. There you go, Rich. A nice plug. So he really talks about, his time previous to starting Menlo and what he found working and what he didn't. And when he started Menlo Innovations, he continued on. And you can actually tour their offices once a month. They do tours of the workspace and what works and what doesn't and why things work. And you can see them doing stand-ups and how those work. So there's reasons behind these things, and there's lots of science behind it.
Is that a book, or is that like, did he publish a book, or is that person just like creating articles? What's the person you just mentioned? Sorry.
Rich Sheridan, Sheridan. He wrote Joy Inc. He's also published one or two other books since then. But he really talks about what's going, why it works and how well it works, and his understanding of how they look at team members, how they hire team members.
Okay.
And they look for personality, not only skill set and willingness to learn. So you have all these different aspects that we can train people to do anything as long as they have the right mindset. And XP really fosters that, in my experience.
Gotcha. No, that's really cool. I feel like that's an attitude that a lot of people hiring should have. At the end of the day, we're all people, and if we have the right attitude and the willingness to learn, then you can teach us anything, right? So
exactly. And if you think about it, when you bring in a new software engineer, maybe fresh out of school, even if they come in, as an intern over the summer, a lot of times they're going to be paired with somebody else to help them get their environment stood up, to help them understand the code base, and help them get started on their way. And a lot of times they're going to ask somebody for help, and they're going to have to go through side by side, pairing what they're trying to work on. So a lot of times our teams work in the same fashion without even really realizing it.
So we're just kind of taking that experience and pushing it to the next level, to where that collaboration gets intermingled all the more, and you get the more value out of it, right?
Exactly. And when you think about, and one of the things that extreme programming talks about is, what's your biggest challenge? How do we get past that? Well, figure out all the challenges that you have. As a team, can we get past the biggest hurdle first? That's causing problems. Whether that's something with the code, releasing something, doesn't matter what it is. And let's knock that out, and let's go to the next one and the next one. And when you start thinking about it from that perspective, you're doing these little experiments, and it's becoming, over time, you're going to have things that aren't going to be as easy to knock out. And when you start thinking about pairs and swarms and pairs of pairs working together to knock an issue out, you've got all this synergy happening.
Yep. Or conflict with it that you need to get over as well. So
yeah, that can happen. But when you have teams that have, when you're pairing if you're pairing as a rule of thumb, there's different thought processes on how you pair. So you have, some teams will pair for an entire day and then change pairs tomorrow. They may switch morning and afternoon pairs. There's some teams that will have a pair for an entire sprint if they're utilizing these practices in Scrum, and then change them during the next sprint. So everybody's having to get used to each other and used to different coding styles. And it levels everybody up while you're doing this.
Awesome. The continuous improvement. That's what I like.
Exactly.
So do you find that teams will naturally, I mean, they're probably taught many of these things in school now or with other companies. Have you had a hard time pushing or getting teams to use these practices, or how have you rolled out these practices? Have you had resistant teams to these practices?
Most teams are resistant.
Most teams are resistant.
That I've worked with.
Okay.
Because you're changing their work style. You're going to slow. The perception is they're going to be slow. They're going to slow down, and they don't want to slow down. They want to continue to work. And it's yes, you're going to slow down in the short term, just like anything else, because you're learning something new. But once teams understand this something new, they're even faster than they were before. And a lot of times what I've had to work with teams on is, let's just try a small experiment. Let's try test-driven development first. Well, let's have one person who wants to learn about it. And let them try writing instead of jumping in and writing code first and then having to write tests around what they did, figure out what you're being asked to do. Now think about the unit tests that you have to write. Write those unit tests first. And then once those unit tests are written, both your positive and your negative test cases, write just enough code to get past them. What that does is, and what that teaches, is that you're writing far less code in the system. Which means it's far, and you're also working on your code coverage.
Okay.
And that's a big concern for a lot of companies. And a lot of engineering groups and CIOs and CTOs. Well, how good is our code quality? If we can write our test first and write just enough to get it to pass, and we check all that in and nothing breaks as a result through our continuous integration and continuous deployment systems, great. Now we're writing higher quality code in less time, and we're delighting our customers that much faster.
Okay. So if I'm hearing you correctly, it's like get them to try it for a sprint as a test, and then if that doesn't seem to fly for the team, have one person look into it and just have one person try it to be able to share their experience with the team. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah,
okay.
You have one person try it. Ask for, have one volunteer. Doesn't matter who it is. You want to try it? Great. Why don't you take a look at it? We can sit down, we can talk about it. I can point you in some directions. And then you can start, pick something small. Pick a piece of functionality that's small that you can prove this out on. So all we're doing is an experiment here.
Okay.
And we go from there.
So have you ever had leadership that was resistant to the idea of slowing down or to using some of these practices?
In a lot of companies, leaders are adverse to slow down.
Mm-hmm.
because of perceived pressure on timelines and deadlines.
How did you get them to overcome that, or what have been some ways that you've to help address that?
So it's working backwards. Why are they reticent or resistant to this change? Understanding the concerns that the leader has, helping them understand, yes, we might have one person who's going to be a little bit slower, or one team in the short term, but we're taking 2 weeks right now to prove this out for the team. Surely we can have 2 weeks out of an entire year, or one person's, 80 hours for one person out of an entire year's worth of work to try something as an experiment. Most companies are learning companies. They want to learn new things. They want to experiment. They want to try new things. They want to figure out how to be better. And helping a leader understand, this is going to help us. It's going to help you. It's going to help our customers. Because now we're going to reduce our call rates, calling in complaints that our software is broken or our applications are broken. Then we can work from that perspective.
Gotcha. Cool. I think those are all the questions I had. Any final comments, Mike? Or
There's a lot out there about extreme programming, a lot of these principles, and it takes. I'm no expert in it. I'm still learning about them, every single day. And that's the thing. You have to have that mindset.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I had you on here is because I'm learning about it, and I'm like, I don't want to know if I can talk about this confidently. Let me get Mike on here. So he's done a lot more teams than I have. Let me hear his take on things. So, and I'll put the links that I'm researching and I've looked at in the description below, as well as I'll try to find that book that Mike mentioned earlier, and I'll put it in the description as well for you guys that are watching. But thanks so much for watching. If you like this video, make sure to hit the like button, and of course, share it with your friends that may need it. And keep on learning, guys. Thanks so much, Mike, for your time.
Thanks, James. Have a good afternoon.
You too.